Is the longest psalm in the first book in Psalms. You may notice that Psalms itself, the book of Psalms, is divided or subdivided into 5 books internally. And the first, I believe, 41 Psalms make up the first book in the book of Psalms. This is the longest psalm in that first section. It is 50 verses long. I am going to read the whole thing. So brace yourself now. You can make plans to escape to get some water in the lobby or sneak out when you want to. But I'm going to read the whole thing. And the reason I'm going to do that is it is important, I think, to look at these parts of the Bible as being a coherent whole. The Psalms were written as complete ideas or an entirety, in the same way that it is both useful and beneficial to study the epistles in the New Testament individually and by verse, but they were not really written that way. They were written as a coherent whole, a letter containing a set of ideas, and the Psalms individually function in much the same way. They are intended to be understood and experienced as a whole rather than verse by verse. Now, clearly there's that tension between study and reading and experiencing it as a whole, but I don't think that we often, or as often as is maybe beneficial, go through them in their entirety in one go. So we'll have a word of prayer. I'll read the psalm, and then we'll see how much time we have to talk about the 50 verses in Psalm 18. So if you would pray with me, please. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We are grateful for this time. We are grateful for this opportunity to meet with brothers and sisters, to look into the word that you have given us and to study it. We ask that you would bless us as we do so, that we may better understand it. And through understanding it, we may better understand you and your will for our lives, so that we can do the things that please you, that glorify you, that bring you the honor that you deserve. Father, we are grateful for this opportunity, this time. We are grateful for the very lives that we lead. But we are most thankful, Father, that you sent your Son, Jesus, that he was a sacrifice in our behalf to redeem us. And we pray these things in his name. All right, Psalm 50, as befits the longest psalm here in book 1 of Psalms. This also has one of the longest introductions as well. So, for the chief musician of David, the servant of Yahweh, who spoke to Yahweh the words of this song in the day that Yahweh delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I love you, O Yahweh, my strength. Yahweh is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in him will I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my high tower. Praised one, I call to Yahweh, and I am saved from my enemies. The cords of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodliness made me afraid. The cords of Sheol were round about me. The snares of death came upon me. In my distress I called to Yahweh, yea, I cried out to my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry before him came into his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled, and the foundations of the mountains quaked and were shaken, because he was wroth. There went up smoke out of his nostrils, and a fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down, and thick darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub and flew, yea, he soared upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his hiding place, his pavilion round about him, darkness of waters, thick clouds of the skies. At the brightness before him his thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. And Yahweh thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. And he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and lightnings manifold and routed them. Then the channels of waters appeared, and the foundations of the world were laid bare. At your rebuke, O Yahweh, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. He sent from on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They came upon me in the day of my calamity, but Yahweh was my stay. He brought me forth also into a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. Yahweh rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands, he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of Yahweh, and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his ordinances were before me, and his statutes I did not put away from me. I was also perfect with him, and I kept myself from my iniquity. And Yahweh recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands before his eyes. With the merciful you will show yourself merciful. With the perfect man you will show yourself perfect. With the pure you will show yourself pure. And with the perverse you will show yourself a wrestler. For you will save the afflicted people, but haughty eyes you will lay low. For you will light my lamp. Yahweh my God will lighten my darkness. For by you I run upon a troop, and by my God I leap over a wall. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of Yahweh is tried. He is a shield to all those who take refuge in him. For who is God, save Yahweh? And who is a rock besides our God? The God who girds me with strength and makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like hinds' feet and sets me upon my high places. He teaches my hands to war so that my arms bend a bow of bronze. You have also given me the shield of your salvation, and your right hand has held me up, and your gentleness has made me great. You have enlarged my steps under me, and my ankles have not slipped. I will pursue my enemies and overtake them. Neither will I turn again till they are consumed. I will smite them through, and they shall not be able to rise. They shall fall under my feet. For you girded me with strength for battle. You caused those who rose up against me to bow under me. You also made my enemies turn their backs to me, that I might cut off those who hate me. They cried out, but there was none to save, even unto Yahweh, but he did not answer them. And I shall beat them small as the dust before the wind, as the mire of the streets I emptied them out. You have delivered me from the strivings of the people. You have made me the head of the nations. A people whom I have not known shall serve me. As soon as they hear of me, they shall obey me. Foreigners shall submit themselves to me. Foreigners shall fade away and shall come trembling out of their close places. Yahweh lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be the God of my salvation. The God who executes vengeance for me and subdues peoples under me. He rescues me from my enemies. Yea, you lift me up above those who rise up against me. You deliver me from the violent man. Therefore I will give thanks to you, O Yahweh, among nations, and to your name I will sing praises. Great salvations he gives to his king, and shows loving kindness to his anointed, to David and to his seed forevermore. Very long. I appreciate you bearing with me. So, one of the questions I always like to ask first, what is this psalm about? Not necessarily a trick question, but something to talk about first. What's it about? I'm sorry? Praising God's greatness, certainly, yeah. Mm-hmm. Something that many of the Psalms are about. What else? Yes, being delivered from his enemies, certainly, yeah. Yeah, it is the greatness of God, the deliverance from enemies, the faithfulness and kindness of God to those that love him and follow him. Are there any songs that we sing that are based on this psalm? If you have a King James Version, you probably noticed it more readily as we went through. I'm sorry? Verse 46? Yeah, they pair up verse 3 with verse 46 usually. Yeah, from the beginning and from the end. So, I will call upon the Lord, right? Who is worthy of praise, so shall I be saved from my enemies. And then they jump all the way to 46 for the next part of it. The Lord liveth, and blessed be my rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. It's I think almost word for word exactly from the King James Version. Unless you have the King James Version, though, it doesn't quite sound the same when you go through, so it's a little more obscure. But yeah. This is also actually found, mostly, it's not word for word exactly the same, but in 2 Samuel 22. There is a psalm that is recorded there for David on the occasion of being rescued or preserved from Saul that is almost the exact same. Now, there are some word differences, and I'm not going to, there's too much here to really even think about trying to draw 2 Samuel 22 into this and deal with both of these 50 verse, or 51 verse in the case, I think, of 2 Samuel, chapters in one morning. But it is worth going and looking at, in particular, because it is almost the same. And it does seem to indicate that when the book of Psalms was composed, collected together, right, these songs were collected, that this particular one had undergone some sort of change, either before it was recorded in 2 Samuel or before it was put in Psalms, one or the other, so that some of the language is tweaked a little bit. And I think that this is fairly comparable to the way that we can see sometimes in our own hymnals and the songs that we sing, things that are familiar to us. Occasionally, you're singing it somewhere new or different or from a different book, and you start to sing a word and you realize, wait a minute, that's not the word they have written down here. Someone has changed the language just slightly on me, and now I feel foolish. I just sang the wrong word very loud. But it doesn't really change the sense or the meaning of what we're talking about. The psalm, because that's really what it is, in 2 Samuel, is the same psalm as what we have here. It is about David. It is about his preservation from his enemies. It is about how God defends him in much the same language, but there are a few minor differences in some of the wording. So worth looking at if you haven't. Yeah, I will call it worth. So you can break this psalm down into 3 sections, probably. You could probably divide this any number of ways, but this is what I'm going to do for this morning for ease of this. In the first part of the psalm, in the first 3 verses, we get a sort of preamble, talking about how God delivers those that are devoted to him, right? That he speaks of his devotion to God and speaks of the salvation from God that God gives to those. And it gets a theme that gets repeated later. If we remember in several verses on, he talks about how his righteousness is what causes God to rescue him, or he's rescued and rewarded according to his righteousness. But this idea comes most prominently here at the beginning as kind of this preamble. Then the next section, he talks about how God is actually intervening in a supernatural way to deliver his people. That God will intervene not just in ways that are like, was that God? Was that just coincidence? But that it can be obvious that God is stepping in and taking a hand to deliver his people. He's intervening in the natural world. We see this in the discussion of floods and earthquakes, God coming on a storm, that these things are changes from what we would expect in the natural order of things. And then concluding that God is both worthy of praise and glory. I think I left the Y off of word in there. Not just for what he does, but for who he is. And this is an important point to remember about the nature of God, and when we go through these kinds of discussions about praising God and glorifying God, that it is not dependent on God doing things for us then to be needful for us to praise him, or for him to be deserving and worthy of our praise and glory. He is entitled to that by his nature, regardless of his actions. And this can be a difficult concept for, the outside non-Christian pagan world to grasp, right? That God is entitled to it not as an exchange, right? He will give me a thing and then I will glorify him in return, because once he has done that, I will then. We're not bargaining with God. God is worthy of our praise and glory, right, that we give to him regardless. And it's important for us to remember that when we're thinking about who God is and what our right relationship with him ought to be. So, as promised, last week, at the end of class, I said this would be very long, and that there wouldn't be time to go into everything. So this is an exciting opportunity. If anyone has prepared ahead of time, is there something in this psalm that you wanted to talk about? We can leap to that verse wherever it happens to be. I have other things to talk about just in case. Don't feel like you have to come up with something. But if you want to talk about something, let's do it. Yes?
I thought it was very odd in verse 11 that it says, "He made darkness his covering," because God is light.
Sure.
And it seems kind of wrong.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we have that association of ideas with God, right? God is light. God is, right, this sort of...
And verse 12, out of the brightness of his presence.
Yeah, we get that in the following verse, too. Exactly.
Bright and have a covering of darkness.
So how do we reconcile these ideas? what is the connection or what is the reason that we would associate one darkness and then brightness with the Lord?
He's showing his fury.
Okay, his anger, sure. When God turns his face away, right, he denies light to those that, if we see this.
To create rain, thunderbolts, and stuff like that, you need dark clouds, you need darkness.
Sure, certainly. With the storms, we associate darkness, storms with darkness, or maybe the other way around. We see this on with the crucifixion as well, right? What happens when Jesus is crucified and God turns his face away, right? He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? What unnatural event occurs during that moment? Or during that? I'm sorry?
The sun goes away.
The sun goes away. Darkness covers the earth. Yeah. That when God is angry or God is imposing punishment or withdrawing his favor, as he is doing here in the psalm, right? He has opposed the enemies of David. Darkness envelops them. Light is taken away because that is within God's control. Something that he can remove. Yeah. Other verses, other ideas, other points. Anyone?
Smoke out of his nostrils.
Smoke out of his nostrils, yeah. Yeah, which is a great metaphor. I mean, it's certainly emblematic of anger, right? I'm sure anybody who's seen those old Warner Brothers cartoons where Bugs Bunny is, doing some bullfighting, right? Was the cartoon representation of an angry bull, right? The hunch, right? The hump in the back, they accentuate that, the way that people pull their shoulders up when they get angry, you frown, and then the snort, the bull snorting with the smoke coming out of the nostrils is emblematic of anger and power and anger. And it has a long pedigree as being that kind of metaphor. Yeah, that you were so angry the smoke is coming out of your nostrils. You're burning up with heat and anger. Yeah.
I would like to add on to what you said earlier too. So basically, if he makes darkness his canopy, that means he's in charge of darkness too. So he's both in charge of darkness and light, in charge of everything. So that could even show Satan that I have power over you if I take your darkness.
Yeah. It's important to realize that God is in control of all of these things.
All the elements.
Yeah, that whether it is a thing that is beneficial or a thing that is detrimental, God has power over that. And one of the ways that it helps me, at least, to think about those things is that things that are to our detriment are usually a thing that is a deprivation of what is good, right? That what God gives us and what we get from him is his goodness, and anything that is good ultimately comes from him, has its source in him. And to be without that is to be deprived of the mercy of God or the grace of God in some way. That whether it is specific that we have turned our back and are not partakers in the mercy and grace that comes through Christ, or whether it is simply a lack of that common grace that is provided to us all, right? That God sustains the world and everything in it through his power and majesty and who he is. And that when things, we are lacking something, it is because we are lacking some element that God would provide.
And his grace, that's when darkness comes in.
Yeah. When we do not have the grace of God, the darkness follows. I mean, again, the connection with the crucifixion, right? Jesus taking on the punishment for sins, being closely associated with that darkness, right? That with God imposing punishment. Yeah.
There's an anecdote about Einstein when he was being taught. Somebody asked him how you measure cold. He said, you don't measure cold. Cold is the absence of heat, just like evil is the absence of God.
Sure. Right. Yeah, this is one of those things that argues against, or that shows that Christianity is opposed to the dualist, the kind of Manichaeist thought of there being both the yin and the yang, the equal of light and darkness. That's not really how the universe is. There is that which is good, and then there's the absence of it. It's just simply a lack. Yeah. In the same way that heat is a thing that exists, but cold is not. It is just the lack thereof of that energy.
They don't like to think of running all ourselves.
I'm sorry, I couldn't
So
quite.
we don't like to think that we bring punishment on ourselves.
No, we don't like that thought frequently. Sadly, when we do receive that punishment from God, it is we are getting what we deserve, right? I think of Hamlet when the players come to Elsinore and he sends them off to be housed with what's the name of the Polonius, his father's kind of right-hand man. He says, see that you treat them well. And Polonius says, I will treat them as they deserve. And Hamlet says, no. I'm paraphrasing. He says, you have to treat them much better. You treat every man as he deserves, and who will escape a whipping? Right? We are all bad people who deserve punishment. Right? There's a recognition that none of us deserve good things in and of ourselves. It is only through the grace of God that we have them. Yeah.
But it's our response to God that's important, how we look at God and how we accept his favor or reject it.
Yes, yeah, that we are afforded that opportunity. Yeah, I mean, as it says in the New Testament, God does not wish anyone to perish, but desires for everyone to come to repentance. And it is our rejection of that brings that punishment on us. Other thoughts, comments? This is great, right? The more you talk, the less I have to. Happier I am. Yeah. All right. Well, I do have a few things. They're mostly in the first few verses. So, the word used here in the first verse, most Bibles, most translations, is just simply represented as love. We're all aware, certainly in the New Testament, of the inadequacy of just saying love when there were multiple different Greek words to express different kinds of affection. Equally here, this does not really give us a sense of what David, the author here, is saying. The word that is translated love here is actually only used this way this once in the Bible. Normally, it is usually used as a way to describe God's love for his people. So it is usually used to express the nature of God's love towards us rather than the other way around. This used by David to describe his love for God is the only use of this. And it kind of gives it an extra power or strength or describing a greater depth of emotion than we would normally expect. We get a few military metaphors coming up here in the first couple verses as well. Verse 2, we have the rock, fortress, deliverer, shield, horn, stronghold, or tower, depending on your translation. So some of these are fairly understandable. Fortress, right? That's a military thing, right? Tower or stronghold. But what about a rock? Why is rock, in this instance, a military metaphor? Or horn, if you'd rather talk about that one, which is also not as obvious to us, perhaps.
The rock is hard and solid.
Yes. Yeah, a rock is a good place to be. You have good footing. It's not going to give way under you. It is a place that you can use as a defense, right? Because this comes up later when it speaks of God raising him with his right hand, or God being on your right hand or being your right hand is, again, a strong military metaphor for people that fought with a shield and a sword or a spear. That you were undefended on your right-hand side. And so having someone to your right upon whom you could depend, on whom you could rely, was essential. Because that was where the danger would come from. It was the undefended place. And a rock allows you, if you orient yourself properly, to put something strong, immovable, hard against your side to help defend you, right? It is a strategic kind of positioning thing. What about a horn?
Is that the bugle call to the cavalry bringing the troops?
Could be. It certainly could be. There's actually, when I was doing the work to think about this, people don't agree on exactly what this is talking about. It could be the horn that rallies people or calls people to battle, or tells people to charge, or gives commands of some kind, right? That we had this well, compared to the biblical times, recently with cavalry, right? The cavalry bugle, that they would actually give orders on the battlefield with different kinds of bugle calls, right? They would play a different series of notes or, a simple tune in order to tell people to charge, to retreat, to move left, to move right. Right? You could give commands using a horn.
Mine says that it symbolizes strength.
And it's also very true that it was used as a symbol of strength and power, often associated with military force, or the monarchy. Kings were understood to be associated with horns, right? That you were strong and had power, and so it can be used as a metaphor simply for great might. Yeah. There are some people that argue as well, though I didn't see as much of this, that there are horns that are on the altar as well. It would have been in the tabernacle rather than the temple, right? Of course, in David's time, because they did not have the temple that was built by his son Solomon. But the altar had horns placed at each corner, though those are more associated with defense or fleeing, in a sense, right? That you could go to the tabernacle and take hold of the horns on the altar, and you were then protected from people that were pursuing you. You could not legally be touched. There's an example of this, I want to say it was with Absalom, one of the generals that supported his son Absalom when he tried to revolt against David, managed to get to the altar and take hold of the horns of the altar to try and save his life. He was, again, using that. It works as a representation of the power of God, right? That you are relying and trusting in God, but it is probably one of the other metaphors that's actually intended here. And then God delivers him because he finds his refuge in God. He's putting his trust and his faith in God. That these are all actually just metaphors. He's not actually talking about a literal rock. He's not talking about a literal fortress. He's not talking about a literal shield. But he is trusting in God to be these things for him, to defend him. And in a sense, because he trusts in God, God then defends him. All right, let's move on. The next verse, verse 3, we already talked about being part of the song. We get down to verse 4 and verse 5. There's actually a number of references here that are probably specific references to Canaanite gods. Or I should have it say this. It's not quite the way I want to put it. That are references to specific Canaanite gods, not specific references. Did I say that right the first time? Regardless, there was a Canaanite god of death, and then he speaks as well of the torrents of destruction, right? The cords of death entangle me. The torrents of destruction, the waves, the deluge, right? Water rushing. There were Canaanite gods of chaos as well that are associated with the sea and with rivers. And this is repeated later on in different parts of this, where he refers to his foes and talks about these things. There's did I put it in the next note? Yeah. In 2 Samuel, this is one of the wording changes. It's not cords of death, it's waves of death. And so there's this association in both of them in these verses that appear to be making reference to the gods, the pagan gods of the people that lived round about Israel. The people that would have been in opposition, particularly Philistines, right? Or the people of Edom. The gods of the neighboring countries who would have been opposed to God, and the people that worshiped them that would have been opposed to David. Speaking specifically of God rescuing him from them, defending him from them, and God being more powerful than any of these other deities as a way of asserting or emphasizing or talking about God's reality, or God's primacy, that he is the God above whom there is no other. And again, this is a theme that returns later when he asks, who else can claim to be God? Verse 31, who is God besides the Lord? Who is the rock except our God? He is talking down the deities in whom the enemies of Israel put their hope and confidence, and speaking of it and bolstering or praising the true God who defends and protects him and protects Israel. It is an interesting kind of way of doing this. Again, as one of the commentaries as I was looking at it, as I was going through, thinks that this is a specific way of, taunt is probably the wrong word, but it is a way of almost like a fight song in a sense, or a hype, trying to get everybody kind of hyped up about the way that you would about a rival school for a football game almost, right? That you want to talk about how great we are and how they can't deal with it. That these other gods are powerless against the God of Israel, that they cannot stand up and oppose him, that though they may be able to overwhelm David, right, verse 4 and verse 5, that when he cries out to the Lord in verse 6, we see the coming of God and what happens in the verses that come after that, for 10, 15, 20 verses after that, of how God comes in power and glory and majesty to rescue him and to utterly overwhelm their enemies. I just get really caught up in all this language. So I'm going to pause here. Comments, questions about this section, this preamble. The last few points I have for here is going to really shift gears, so I don't want to give anybody a whiplash as we're doing that. All right, you're very kind to just sit there and listen to me talk. Also in verse 4, there's a reference, is it verse 4? Did I put the right verse down? I don't know that I did. Ungodliness, I don't think that I did. That's not right. No, I guess it is. Verse 4, it was the different translation. Destruction. It's destruction in the NIV and ungodliness, I think, here in my the modification from the ASV. This word is actually Belial in Hebrew, which we may know from associations with other things. Has anyone ever heard that word before? The Hebrew word Belial.
Yes, but I don't remember where.
That's fine. It is sometimes used, that's actually my third bullet point that I've not gotten to yet, as a personification that will speak of people that are sons of Belial, essentially agents of destruction and ruin. And this is usually reserved for things that are really bad, like really bad stuff. It is a wickedness, as I have up there, that destroys the social order. Things come undone, right? If you've ever heard, there's a poem, I think, where it talks about the center will not hold, about things falling apart. And that's what this is talking about, that this refers to acts that just completely upend things. So, vile and heinous crimes. I'm not going to read about this, but you can go look it up for yourself. The story in Judges 19, it is a terrible story about people doing terrible things to a young woman. This is the word that is used there for something that is just vile and heinous. It is for disgraceful and murderous kinds of sins. This, 1 Kings 21, refers to Naboth and his vineyard that was coveted by the king, the wicked king. And what did the king do? He hired two people to go into court and lie about him, saying that he had cursed God and the king. And it refers to their sin of lying in that manner in order that he might be judicially murdered for a crime he did not commit, so that his land might be stolen. The Belial is used to describe how bad that is. Right? If you cannot depend on the king and the justice system to work properly, if those who are supposed to sit in judgment will suborn perjury in order that you may die, you don't have society anymore. Everything has fallen apart. You can't depend on anything. And this is what this is talking about. There's a couple more. It also refers to blasphemous and impious conduct as well. The sons of Samuel are what are referenced here. They broke the laws that they were supposed to uphold as priests. They engaged in cultic pagan practices in the tabernacle, doing things that were against God in terrible ways. And they were struck down and killed. Right? And then as well, crimes against the king. Right? Attacking or opposing the Lord's anointed. So when it says the torrents of destruction or the torrents of ungodliness overwhelmed him, this is what he's referring to. That these are the things that are threatening not just to destroy him, not just to affect me personally, but this is the world itself. Everything that we know and rely on and depend on is being upended. Right? That things are falling apart in a way that seems irreparable. How do you recover from a society that disintegrates? Right? Putting things back together is very, very difficult. This is the same one that then gets used later as a noun for destruction or personified as the destroyer, or with reference to the Antichrist in the New Testament. It's used that way as a Belial. So it's a way of talking about exactly how bad that particular word is. Anyone else have any other thoughts or comments at this point? I mean, I can keep going. Those are my notes, but there's so much here. Anyone? All right. Well, before we finish this up here, I wanted to move to what verse is it? This is the problem with using two different Bibles, is that you're not in the same place on the page. Here we are. Verse 20, verses 20 through 24. The Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands he has rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, I have not done evil by turning from my God. I won't read the whole thing here, but you can look at it. How is this possible? Wait, are we talking about David here? Isn't this the guy with Bathsheba? Didn't he do a census later on? If he's such a great guy, why did his son revolt against him and try and take over the kingdom? Seems like it's possibly indicative of not being the best father he could have been. I don't know. Got to be careful, right? I got my own kids. Who knows what they're going to do, and then, I might have impugned myself. But how can he say this? Yeah.
I kind of wrote straight my hand back a long time ago.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I?
I didn't catch your eye.
I beg your pardon.
When you were talking about if people got rewarded according to what they deserve,
Mhm.
anyway, the guy said, "Now we better reward him according to the way we want him treated, not necessarily what he deserves." And I think he followed that was if everybody was treated the way they would deserve, that nobody would be treated well, basically, is what he was saying. And I was going to bring this subject up
Of these verses here?
right here.
Mhm.
He actually says, basically said he's sinless.
In verse 23, I have been blameless before him and kept myself from sin.
And it goes on, and drives the point home. The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness,
Mhm.
according to the cleanness of my hands in his sight. That was a long time. He rewarded him according to that well.
Yeah, that's what he says, right? He certainly talks about how his righteousness is the reason for his reward.
But he certainly had, if this is David, he certainly had a giant chasm there, and so,
Yeah, how do we reconcile David writing these things about himself and saying that I have been rewarded according to my sinlessness, my blamelessness, my righteousness, and who he is? Yes, sir.
You have to remember, David sinned, but he was a very repentant person.
Mhm.
And he did. His mate kept him righteous.
Yeah, he certainly repented of his sin, but it didn't, he was not without his sin.
None of us are.
No, and none of us are. And I think that
He was the
David was the same way. The answer, in terms of being laid out explicitly is, it's in my favorite book, I will never, pass up an opportunity to mention this, is Hebrews, where it talks about the faith that they had, that the patriarchs and the men of the Old Testament, the people of the Old Testament, it's not just men even in chapter 11 that are mentioned, was credited to them, their faith is credited to them as righteousness. Right? That they put their faith in God and trusted in Him and were credited to be righteous in the same way. And this is not so dissimilar from us. Right? I am not righteous by my own deeds, but through my faith in God and my trust in the blood of Jesus Christ. Right? That through that faith, I am credited with righteousness and accounted this way, and in the sight of God, He sees me as being righteous. Not through my own efforts, not through something that I have done or deserved, but through what God has done for me through His Son. Yeah. This is probably, I should have left more time to go into this topic, but here I am at the end of my time. Yeah.
Did you want to get into faith works discussion?
There is an awful lot there. I've been mentioning this maybe not every time. Frequently when it comes up in the Psalms as we've been going along, but I'm sure it will come up again. Any final thoughts? Any final points, questions that have to be made? I have successfully run actually past the end of my time. Didn't manage to end early. I don't have time for complaints this morning. Just a question if you have one. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate your attention and your being here. We will move on and talk about Psalm 19 next week. Thank you very much.